understanding that we're in a transition period. I think as you create content, you'll start to look at more in-depth content, look at, the old mentality of, oh, our blog posts on our site need to be 750 words for every single blog post. I still hear that from clients who want a 750 word blog post on every post. And I think that's not something we want to focus on. We want to focus on what is the right enough amount of content to get the point across on that topic. And so you have that's a particular focus, especially with not just how much you're writing, but what you're writing and what you're covering. That's content for the site, et cetera. Internal links, definitely need appropriate internal links from page to page, not just in navigation. A good site structure, still focus on getting some links and getting that trust and authority. But I think some of that now in the age of AI, we're at the point where we can get some of that trust and authority based on the content that we're producing, not necessarily just from links. Hi, this is Bill Hartzer, and this is SEO in 2026.
What's your number one SEO tip for 2026?
I think my number one answer for 2026, it has been, really not changed for the past few years, is, classic traditional SEO, best practices for creating content and for just optimizing pages and optimizing websites. What I'm seeing is a lot of the AIs, they do understand content, and some search engines, you can get away with, let's see, 150 words of content, and can potentially rank on a page. However, when we come to AI, it's more about really structuring a page, using the traditional, right title tags, right meta description tags, right, using the right heading, H1s, H2s, H3 tags, bulleted lists, ordered lists, numbered lists, bold italics, etc. And so kind of focusing in on the main what I call traditional SEO tactics, those really haven't changed in 20 years that I've been doing this.
Okay, so you say 20 years, a lot of core SEO principles have remained the same. So what are the key aspects of SEO that we've been doing for the last 20 years that are still vitally important?
A lot of those tactics, just optimizing web pages, the on-page SEO, and doing, like I said, optimizing a page, structuring the content properly.
Okay, so you can say optimizing a page. Obviously, we've got many different AI-powered search engines, as well as Googlebot and other search engines crawling websites nowadays. Are they looking for different things? Do we perhaps structure the web page slightly differently for the age of AI?
No, I don't think so. What I'm finding is that that optimizing a page, having a good page structure, essentially having an introductory paragraph of content, overview of the page, then you have your talking points and of the content, and then essentially summing it up at the end using things like heading tags, bold, italics, etc., and make it easier for the visitor to read that page. And we know that people scan pages, and having headings, having enough content. I'm finding that the past 2 to 3 years, where I go much more in depth with content, that tends to actually do well on the AIs. That the AIs tend to pick up a lot more and recommend you as a website or you as a source when you have 3,500 words on that page. about that subject versus most people or most sites or your competitors maybe have, 500 words or less.
Okay. So you talk a bit about perhaps the way that you've published content or the volume of content has changed over the years. Interesting that you talk about 500 words or less there as well. Do you think having voluminous articles, voluminous pages gives you an advantage for AI?
I think it does definitely give you an advantage. I think that the, one area that I kind of focus in is entities, and looking at specifically if there is a page of content, and you can even ask ask an AI, your favorite AI, say, I'm writing a page about this topic. What are the entities, the titles, the headings? What are all the topics and subtopics and the entities, if you will, that I need to mention on this page to make it a great piece of content? And so AI will actually come back and say, hey, you're talking about, let's say, home inspection. Well, you need to mention these topics: real estate, house, home, foundation, etc., in your content. And so it's not just necessarily just saying, okay, it's 500 words or less. Well, technically, you could probably mention all those, what you need to mention in that content. You probably need to mention it. You could mention it in 500 words or less, but if you are really going more in depth and appealing more towards an AI and showing that you are the expert in that topic, then it's just naturally going to come out as being a page that has more words. There, you can cover a topic certainly in 500 words, but you could also, I've seen pages in certain industries that are 30 to 35,000 words on one web page. It's not about the length. It's about the content and what needs to be there in order to, in order to show that your page is superior and has more content than others.
So you're saying it's not necessarily going to make a difference whether you have 30,000 words on one page or 500 words on 60 different pages. It's all about whether or not it's relevant and appropriate and the subject matter is related. And that's the decision that's the way that you come up with the decision.
Yes. One of the areas that you can do, that we've done for years, is that, okay, well, when you do a keyword search for a keyword in our search query in Google, what's showing up currently in the search results? Are your, keyword, we call them keyword competitors, are those keyword competitors that are showing up, do they have 30,000 words on the page, or is it just very short and sweet content? One area is to look at content length. You go into a little bit more detail and mention more of the appropriate topics or subtopics and entities on that page, and you're going to, be right up there with the competitors, if you will, that are ranking currently.
One challenge with the age of AI is the fact that obviously content can be produced so easily, and that it's perhaps more difficult to tell the difference between the authority of different websites. So what are your thoughts on a few ways that in 2026 we can really differentiate our content from other people out there?
I think it's key, what I've had success with is that, and literally the cool thing is it can happen fast. I've created a new page and done some really heavy analysis on what's ranking well right now in the top 10 results, and comparing that to, okay, what are the topics, and what are they mentioning on the page? What do I need to mention? And can I do that in more, in more depth and have a better piece of content? I've literally done that, created the page, hand submitted it in URL Inspector and Search Console. 45 minutes later, it's crawled, indexed, and Google has it, ranking, top position. So I think, the AIs are, especially Google, are looking at, content differently. I think you do need a lot of the basics. So, you do need to get to a point where you're your website is trusted enough so that it can get, your pages can get crawled and indexed and so forth, meaning that we need links. I think we still today, in 2025, 2026, 2027, going forward, we're still going to need some kind of trust signals. And, those trust signals and authority comes from other websites. We do need some links somewhere.
Okay. So you mentioned links. Obviously, you're talking about external links and internal links there as well. What's best practice in terms of both of them? So, the position of internal links, maybe the keywords incorporated within internal links as well. And from an external link perspective, has the authority of certain links that we may be able to obtain changed over the last few years?
I think we're in this transition period, to be honest with you, let's talk, in 2026 timeframe. Okay. So it used to be that where there was a lot of trust on links and we really needed to get, links. And if you didn't have links from other websites, then you really didn't have any chance of ranking, even if your content was great. That's the way it used to be. I think we're kind of in transition where what I'm seeing is, and evidence of it is also brand dimensions. So you mention of a person, if it's your personal name or if it's a business, for example, Google and AIs are kind of at the point where they're not necessarily looking only at links, that they're looking at brand mentions. So I've seen, a keyword domain, let's say it's 3 or 4 word domain, new website, brand mention, and so forth. And it, and it can rank even in Google because the content on there mentions certain brands and, on topic. And those particular websites don't necessarily have links. So we're kind of in this transition phase where, for more competitive phrases, sure, we do need to get, links, trust, authority, etc. And that tends to also help with crawling and indexing, right? More authoritative websites that get crawled and indexed have their pages crawled and indexed. Internal links, not necessarily. I mean, you can do as it is appropriate if you have 2 pages of content that are similar, that you link those 2 pages with keywords in the anchor text and ideally in the middle of a paragraph, et cetera, and make it contextually important. That we don't necessarily nowadays, it doesn't necessarily have to be the exact batch phrase. It could be 4 or 5 words as long as it's contextually relevant. Internal linking, definitely an important aspect here.
And in relation to external linking, you also mentioned unlinked citations. How do you measure the value of an unlinked citation?
I think that's, it's interesting because my prediction is that, we're going to, as a society, as an industry, we have all this link buying and guest posts and so forth. Well, I think pretty soon we're going to be looking at brand mentions, right? As far as, and so getting your company name or literally your personal name out there and, just mentioned and get it mentioned. And we're seeing this onset of tools, SEMrush and, Ahrefs and et cetera, and even new businesses that are starting up, new SaaS products that are starting up that are measuring those brand mentions, like measuring the brand mentions in AI. How many times your brand is mentioned, in AI. That's the next rank checker, is the brand mention checker. And so I'm just fully kind of starting to understand it, and how those are measured. I know that there are others that are really clued into, how they're measuring brand mentions, in AI and so forth. And I think if it's, as a digital marketer in 2026, it's one area that you really need to start kind of focusing in on is brand mentions.
What's the key takeaway from the tip you shared today?
Understanding that we're in a transition period. I think as you create content, you'll start to look at more in-depth content, look at, the old mentality of, oh, our blog posts on our site need to be 750 words for every single blog post. I still hear that from clients who want a 750 word blog post on every post. And I think that's, that's not something we want to focus on. We want to focus on what is the right enough amount of content to get the point across on that topic. And so you have, that's a particular focus, especially with not just how much you're writing, but what you're writing and what you're covering. That's content for the site, et cetera. Internal links, definitely need appropriate internal links from page to page, not just in navigation. A good site structure. Still focus on getting some links and getting that trust and authority. But I think some of that, now in the age of AI, we're at the point where we can get some of that trust and authority based on the content that we're producing, not necessarily just from links.
Bill Hartzer is CEO at Hartzer Consulting. Find out more over at hartzer.com. Bill, thanks so much for being part of SEO in 2026.
Okay, great. Thanks.
I've been your host, David Bain. Get your copy of SEO in 2026, the book, over at SEOin2026.com.